we have our immediate attention needs to be turned to Christianity in early America. So we're crossing the ocean. Really, until now, our attention has been focused on Europe, starting essentially in Germany and going to Switzerland, and then after that, England and Scotland and all around the other nations of Europe that experienced Reformation, the Netherlands, France, and then of course we've looked at the wars in Europe, the wars of religion. But now we're going to move our attention to America and see about Christianity in the New World. Now, we are going to speak only fleetingly about Catholicism in New Spain. It is not that it is not important. It is not that it did not precede the events that we're going to focus on in the colonies. But nonetheless, with the limited time that we have, we're going to spend most of our time today on Christianity in the colonies. But I do want to at least call your attention to some of the important events that relate to Catholic Christianity in the New World, because they preceded the events that we're going to talk about in the colonies. So we have the settlement in 1493 in the New World, established by Columbus on Hispaniola. 1565, St. Augustine, the city of Florida, was founded, the oldest city in America. We have the El Camino Real was constructed from the upper Rio Grande Valley south to Chihuahua in south to Mexico City, and the purpose was to travel and convert the Pueblo tribe. 1610, Santa Fe was created as a northern outpost. So we see we have the Spanish settling throughout the Mexico, the Southwest, other places in New Spain, and one of their goals was the conversion of the Native Americans. However, conflicting policies, the question was whether to use persuasion or forced submission to the church, and fortunately we see examples of forced submission as well as persuasion. The first missionary work in the New World was conducted primarily by Franciscans, and we should expect that because Francis set the example of mission work for his new order. Francis traveling to Egypt to witness to the Sultan in Egypt. We have the example of Raymond Lull, who went to Tunisia, was the first martyr among the Muslims. So the Franciscans were active in mission work, and the first missionary martyred in America was Juan de Padilla, who was a Franciscan priest. He died in 1542 in what is now Kansas. Think of Kansas as being a hotbed of Christian persecution, but nonetheless, that was a long time ago. All right. Now, the Friars used a fulfillment approach in their view of the relation of native ways to Catholicism. All right. What do we mean by a fulfillment approach to missions?
Once everybody is converted, Jesus will come back.
That sounds like that sounds like some of our dispensational premillennial teachings, but I don't think that was being taught in Mexico at the time. But that's a great idea.
Like the Jesuits, where they would say all their local gods, like Jesus, would spell out of those gods.
Right. Yeah, Jeff is right, that the last time we talked about this fulfillment of approach was when we were talking about the Jesuits, and Matteo Ricci used that kind of approach in China. Kurt, what were you going to add?
I was going to basically state.
Okay, all right. So they would go into a foreign country, and they would say that Christianity fulfills the local religious practices and beliefs. In this case, the centers of tribal life were changed to be centers of Catholic worship. Sacred shrines and natural temple sites were changed into churches and pilgrimage centers. As long as the natives were traveling to these places, well, we'll just change them into Christian sites. Now, when we talked about Matteo Ricci, I read to you an account that was shared with me by one of my former students, Arnold Austin, who is an International Mission Board missionary in Peru, and he talked about the tradition of Llama sacrifice that traditionally was used in the worship of Pachamama, the Mother Earth goddess. All right, but they substituted the Virgin Mary for this Earth goddess, but they kept the rituals. I'm going to show you some video clips if I can pull this up. This is from YouTube. Little video clip of I've actually got 3 clips. They're from 3 different ceremonies, but they show 3 different aspects of the ceremony. But this is kind of the beginning of the celebration to Pachamama. You can see they're parading. They've there's the, where is it? It's coming. Oh, there's the llama. Got drums, very colorful, dancing. Here the llama comes again. Very, you can see the llama itself is decorated. One more time. And I'm so glad that the llama has this opportunity to be celebrated and feted in the center of attention because the llama doesn't have long. I don't know if you can see, this is the heart still beating. And then one more, we see this is after the llama has been buried. They celebrate with beer, coca leaves. See the beer's being sprayed over the burial plot. Looks like they're kind of getting handfuls of beer to drink. But anyway, I'm showing all that just to show that what this fulfillment this kind of syncretism looked like. That they would take some ancient, still very pagan traditions, ceremonies, and just change the name of the god or goddess that was being worshipped. and still being used. So questionable practices, and I think these are not practices that are really valid for mission work throughout the globe. But it was a common practice among the missionaries in New Spain. All right, you've heard of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The legend goes that in 1531, Juan Diego, who was a convert from the Aztec religion to Christianity, reported that he saw a vision of the Virgin Mary at what is now Mexico City. And she told him to ask the Catholic bishop to build a shrine at that site. Formerly, it was a shrine to an Aztec mother goddess. The basilica was built, and Holy Mary of Guadalupe became the patron saint of Mexico. You've probably heard of Our Lady of Guadalupe, all right? And you may have heard of Juan Diego. In 2002, he was canonized as a saint, even though the historical evidence of his reality is suspect. In other words, this person may be canonized as a saint, but this person may never have existed. He may have been only a legend in the history of Catholicism in Mexico. Franciscan missions were built throughout the Southwest, and Junipero Serra was one of the major Franciscan missionaries in the 18th century. He started traveling up the California coast from the south to the north, and one reason why they were so eager to build Franciscan missions along the California coast is that the Russian Orthodox had crossed over from Russia into Alaska, and then they were coming down the Pacific coast, building Eastern Orthodox missions. So that was part of the growth of the Catholic Church. All right, very zealous, following the Catholic Counter-Reformation, building local churches and cathedrals in a Spanish style, and aristocratic bishops approved by the monarch governed religious life, both for the transplanted Spanish-speaking settlers and also for the native peoples through mission parishes. Okay, very quick. Sorry to be so brief. Any questions or comments about Catholicism in New Spain? All right, let's move from the southwest to the northeast to talk about Christianity in the colonies. To the extent that America was shaped by religious values, it was shaped by Protestantism. All right, so at the beginning in the colonies, even though Catholicism was early, it was focused in the Southwest, in regions that were not part of the original English colonies, not part of the original United States. So what became the United States, those 13 colonies, they were dominated by Protestant Christianity. By the end of the colonial period, Congregationalists and Presbyterians were the two largest denominations. Baptists and Anglicans were right behind them, and then Quakers were the fifth largest group. Now, what made the Congregationalists so strong in that area was Massachusetts. 1620, English separatists arrived on the Mayflower and founded the Plymouth Plantations. Now, this group has an interesting history, and you may remember that when we talked about dissenters in England, we talked about John Smith. What's important about John Smith?
Say baptism.
Say baptism, all right? All right, unpack that for us.
Well, he was a hardcore believer in baptism by immersion, and well, since there was nobody to baptize him, he baptized himself, and then went on to baptize the rest of his congregation.
Very good. So what we remember about John Smith is that he was one of those who rediscovered believers' baptism. Okay, and he was part of a separatist congregation that left England and went to Amsterdam because of the persecution in England, and there he and his congregation founded the first English Baptist church. Even though it was in Amsterdam, they followed believers' baptism, and they came out of English separatism. Well, an earlier, John Smith was part of a larger congregation that met at Gainsborough, but they had to split in two because the congregation became too large to escape the notice of the Church of England. And so in order to avoid detection and persecution, they divided into two congregations. The other half of that congregation was led by William Bradford and William Brewster. And this is the group that went to Leiden, Netherlands, in order to escape persecution. And from there, they went on the Mayflower to Massachusetts to found the Plymouth plantation. So it's just interesting that when we think about the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, that they came out of a congregation that included John Smith and Thomas Helwys and those early English Baptists. Eventually, the Plymouth plantations were absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was established in eventually they were established. Eventually, this group was absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691. The Massachusetts Bay Company was formed in 1629, and they began their establishment in 1630. Interestingly, when the king granted the charter to the Massachusetts Bay Company, he made them self-governing, which meant that they did not have to answer to Parliament or the Church of England. And that's most important because that gave them the freedom to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a Puritan or a Congregationalist colony. And so we have the colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, with an established church, which is not the Church of England. It is the Congregationalist Church. So they come out of the Church of England, and they do have the union of church and state, so that the Congregationalist Church can call upon the resources of the Massachusetts government to enforce conformity to the Congregationalist Church. And they are just as intolerant of dissent as the Church of England had been. So these Congregationalists are coming out of the Church of England where they had been persecuted. They're put in a situation where they become the official state church, but instead of saying, we're so grateful for religious liberty, we're going to extend it to all, they said, no, now we are in charge, and we're going to demand conformity to the Congregationalist Church. And even Anglicans who come out of the Church of England are persecuted. So we have kind of a role reversal there. It was not a theocracy. In other words, it wasn't that the church ran the state, but church leaders did have a great deal of influence over policy. Any questions about that? I kind of stumbled through that. But the point is that in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Congregationalists have the authority they always wanted in England. But now they use it to oppress dissenters in the same way they had been oppressed in England. The New England Way. Early Puritans put a stress on relating an experience of conversion as a prerequisite to full church membership. All right, this is important. The Puritans, as we know, were Calvinistic or Reformed in their theology, very much influenced by John Calvin, and yet they did expect that there would be a testimony about conversion before that person would be accepted into full membership. So they did practice infant baptism, as did the Church in Geneva, the Church of England. Most of the churches that they were familiar with that united church and state baptized infants, and the Puritans baptized infants also. And so that baptism then placed them in the covenant community, but the individual was not allowed full membership in the church or the community until that person exhibited a conversion experience. All right, so this required confessing before the congregation that they had experienced God's saving grace. Only men who were in full communion with the church had a role in the colony's public life, and they were only ones who could vote. So it was significant for a man to not only be baptized into the community, but also to make a profession of faith, describe his conversion, receive full membership, so that he could vote in public life. Did y'all catch that? Membership in the church was required for voting in public life. Of course, membership in the church was required for the Lord's Supper. Puritan Congregationalism became the established church in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. And this will be important for us as we continue to talk about Christianity in early America. Well, there was a problem with the plan of the Congregational church, because every infant indeed was baptized, so every person in the community had a place in the covenant community of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But what happens when an individual grows up and does not experience personal conversion and never confesses personal faith in Jesus Christ? That person then is not admitted into full membership of the church, cannot participate in the Lord's Supper, and cannot vote. So then what happens when these unconverted members of the community marry and have children? What about those children? Are they to be baptized and accepted into the covenant community? Because if their parents aren't full members, then upon what basis do we baptize their children? This became a dilemma for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in 1662, they developed what has become known as the halfway covenant, so that the children of second-generation Puritans could bring their children for baptism and halfway membership. All right, so do you catch this? We have unregenerate members of the community bringing their children for baptism, and then as they grow up and are unregenerate, we end up with a majority population of unregenerate members in the community and in the church. Participation in the Lord's Supper remained a privilege only of full members, and so generations grew up without confirming their baptism, and as it says, became unregenerate members of the covenant community. What is the problem with this picture? What's the root of the problem? Infant baptism, okay, as well as a failure to fulfill one's conversion experience. But when you practice infant baptism, as a means of bringing a person into the community, then you're going to have a problem when they do not grow up to profess faith in Christ. So we need to eliminate infant baptism, and then membership in the church then comes from profession of faith and believers' baptism. But of course that is totally foreign to their situation. They've never seen believers' baptism, so they don't know what that is, and so they reject it. Yes,
Okay,
Chris?
I was just making sure, so the non-members, so they actually thought they had their salvation because of the infant baptism.
No,
Why are they still going to church if they're not?
Well, many of them probably are not, to be honest, Chris. They're baptized into the church, but they haven't made a profession of faith. Of course, well, now that I'm thinking on my answer, there were Sabbath laws that did require them to go to church, so they were required to attend church every Sunday. So that's why they're in church. But they're not making a profession of faith. All right, of course, we see this in our churches as well. So I don't want to hold ours up as being perfect either. But nonetheless, they're required to go to church, but they're not exhibiting the fruit of a Christian conversion. All right, Steve, and then Joey.
Is this a universal date, or is this just when the halfway covenant started to become prevalent in church?
Well, of course, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established in 1630. So, about 30 years later, they realized they've got a problem. So 1662 is when the halfway covenant was decided. There were questions about what to do.
Sure.
So 1662 is when the halfway covenant was established.
So this wasn't just something like, not to put something contemporary to our society, or something going on in our society on the hill. But this wasn't just something that was sweeping churches, or churches thinking how to fix it. This was something done by the state or by the local government onto the churches?
No, this was something that was done by the church in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this is very, very focused on one colony, but of course a very large colony. But this was a solution proposed by the church. Okay. But it had implications for the state. Joey?
Why did believers' baptism become such an anomaly in the New Testament?
Oh, well, the believer's baptism is obviously taught in the New Testament, but it fell out of fashion, so to speak, between 200 and 400. All right? Just briefly, a brief history of infant baptism. The first reference we have to infant baptism is in Tertullian's treatise on baptism, written around 200. He acknowledges that infants are being baptized, but he discourages the practice. However, by 250, we have Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, actually writing in the same region, and he is saying, he's in a letter to one of his colleagues. The colleague is asking, should we wait until the 8th day to baptize the infant in imitation of the Old Testament practice of circumcising on the 8th day? And Cyprian says, no, baptize the child immediately, because Cyprian has this belief of salvation by baptism. But even at that point, infant baptism is not universal. We get into the late 300s, and we see at least 2 or 3 men, Gregory of Nyssa and his brother Basil the Great, both coming from a family that's been Christian for several generations. And Basil and Gregory are baptized as adults. So they were not baptized as infants, even though they had been born into a Christian family. But the big change comes from Augustine. Augustine, in his teaching about original sin, teaches that we are born with Adam's guilt, and therefore the way for an infant child's sins to be remitted was baptism. And so from 400 on, we do see infant baptism becoming practiced almost universally. We can see this difference in the architecture of baptistries, and I've got pictures taken from churches in the 400s and 500s where we have baptismal pools. But then we start seeing around 500 we see baptismal fonts being used instead of or alongside of the pools. Joe, you had early to medieval with me already.
I'm very there.
Okay.
It was an awesome class.
Well, thanks. I do spend some time in that class, at least when we're meeting on a weekly basis. I do spend some time talking about infant baptism versus believers' baptism, because that's one of my sugar sticks. But anyway.
Last question.
Yeah.
Did the limited atonement thing from Augustine persuade him into the whole infant baptism because of the original sin thing? Because the Presbyterian Church, you guys know better. Was it Mark Driscoll? Was that the guy? Who did you say? Sproul. Okay. The whole thing with covenant baptism, does that in any way tie into their view on, limited atonement or predestination anyway?
Okay. Okay, we're kind of jumping forward here to, we're not talking about the early church. Limited atonement is a doctrine that came along in the 16th century, not in the early church.
I wasn't sure.
Augustine wrote on predestination,
And that's where
kind of a single-edged predestination, but we don't really get limited atonement until Theodore Beza. So, ask me your question again.
I wasn't sure if they did the baptism thing off of Augustine's view on election. That's what I meant to say.
Well, more on his teaching on original guilt was more what led to infant baptism after Augustine, more so than his teaching on predestination, as I understand it. Okay. So the question is, why did it take so long? Well, because from Augustine forward, of course, Augustine is 400. By then, we already have the union of church and state in the Roman Empire. Constantine legalizing Christianity and giving it favored status. 381, Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So from then on, we have the union of church and state. Therefore, baptism into the church becomes membership in the state, and this is carried forward really through the next centuries, and even among the reformers. As we've talked about this year, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, the Church of England, they all maintain infant baptism and union of church and state. And that's why the Anabaptists were persecuted so severely, because to withhold infants from baptism was a crime against the state. So the Puritans came out of the Church of England, and so they were accustomed to infant baptism and union of church and state, and they just carried that forward into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The only difference is that instead of the Church of England, it's the Congregationalist Church. Does that help? Does that muddy the water? It is kind of complicated, but it does create a problem in Massachusetts Bay Colony, because as I haven't said but will say repeatedly, the Puritans intended Massachusetts to be the city on a hill. It was their expectation that by creating a community that was built upon the Word of God, and where everyone was a member of the correct church, where everyone was worshiping in what they considered to be a biblical way, that they would be the city upon a hill that would attract the attention of the world. Unfortunately, it just did not work out that way. And we're going to see how this halfway covenant led to a degeneracy in the church that is going to set up the need for the First Great Awakening. That's going to come in the next lecture. So let's talk about some other problems in the Congregationalist Church, including the Salem witch trials. In 1692, the witch trials of Salem village left a permanent stain on the Puritan legacy. It was hostility against a few lonely old women, a few new families. One thing that happened was that there were new families that moved into the community, and they raised suspicion. A few teenage girls got hysterical. In just a year, 1692, 1693, there were more than 200 people accused of practicing witchcraft, practicing the devil's magic. 20 of them were executed in just a year's time. Eventually, the colony admitted the trials were a mistake and compensated the families of those convicted. What happened was January 1692, one of the Reverend's daughters, her name was Elizabeth, and she was 9. His niece, Abigail, age 11, they started having fits. They screamed, threw things, uttered peculiar sounds, contorted themselves into strange positions, and a local doctor blamed the supernatural. Another girl named Anne, as age 11, she experienced similar episodes. And as the magistrates began to pressure them to find out what was going on, they blamed 3 women for afflicting them. There was one was a Caribbean slave. There was a homeless beggar woman, and then an elderly, impoverished woman. And all 3 women were brought before the local magistrates and interrogated. Finally, they were put in jail. 2 of the women claimed innocence, but the Caribbean slave said, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." But now the paranoia was planted, and accusations began to just pour over the next several months. Charges against a number of women, even children. Finally, Governor Phipps ordered the establishment of a special court. The first case brought to the court was Bridget Bishop. She became the first person hanged on Gallows Hill for being a witch. There were, as I say, there were 20 others that were hanged during that period of time. Finally, the governor had his own wife accused of witchcraft, and so he brought all arrests to an end, and he released many of many of those who were accused of witchcraft, and dissolved the court. Eventually, he pardoned all who were in prison, but by that time, 19 were hanged. A 71-year-old man was pressed to death with heavy stones. Several people died in jail. Nearly 200 people overall had been accused of witchcraft. Later, more recently, toxicologists have placed the blame for all of this unusual behavior on the part of these girls. Might have been a certain fungus that were part of that area, and might have gotten into the ryeweed and other cereal grasses. Might have actually been part of their bread, but that these foods contaminated with this particular fungus causes muscle spasms and vomiting and delusions and hallucinations. So that may have been the cause for the original actions by these girls that led to their accusations of these women and eventually men and children as well. So anyway, it's an unusual episode, and as I say, it's a stain against Salem Village. Obviously, we all have heard of the Salem witch trials, but anyway, that was just one event that happened during this period of time. All right. On a better note, Harvard College was founded in 1638 as a place to train ministers. Obviously, it has fallen since then. Certainly lost its roots in conservative Christianity. All right, strict Puritan ideals were followed, dissidents were suppressed, often by banishing. There was difficulties in suppressing the dissenters because of the size of the colony. Banished individuals often just went across the borders to set up rival colonies. Puritans back in England often were embarrassed by these actions, and they put pressure on American Puritans to be more lenient. Of course, during the time of the interregnum, when Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector, and Puritans essentially were in charge in England from about 1648 to 1660. During that period of time, they would have been able to put pressure on the American Puritans to change their ways. Well, one of the dissenters, one of the best-known dissenters, was Roger Williams. We talk about him a great deal in Baptist Heritage. He had been a Puritan and then a separatist, and because of persecution in England, he came over to America, and in America he was a little bit too much of a separatist for the Puritans, and so he kind of bounced around from place to place, and ultimately, because of his demand for religious freedom, because of his criticism of the union of church and state in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he was banished. As I recall the story, he was put into prison because of his criticism of the state, and told that that he would be in prison, his wife and children to stay free, but that he was in prison until the spring. But they didn't want to send him out in bad weather during the winter. But he wouldn't shut up, and so just before they were going to come and arrest him and banish him, he actually fled and stayed with the Indians. And ultimately, he founded Rhode Island, 1636, and this was one of the first experiments in religious freedom. But he founded this colony and opened it up for any religion. It was tolerant of all, whether Catholic, Protestant, dissident, Jewish, Muslim, heretic. There was no religious limitations in Rhode Island. 1639, he formed the first Baptist church in America at Providence, Rhode Island. And again, here we have a situation where he has come to believe that infant baptism is not biblical, that the true biblical practice is believer's baptism, but who's going to baptize him? There are no baptized believers. So he has one of the members of his congregation, his name was Earl Holliman, has Mr. Holliman baptize him, and then Roger Williams baptized the other 12 in his congregation. That lasted for about 6 months, and then Roger Williams, just like John Smith, began to question his say baptism, his baptizing himself. Roger Williams came to question the validity of his baptism, which came at the hands of someone who had not been a baptized believer. And so he actually left the Baptist church and kind of became a free spirit, hoping and praying that God would send some apostolic baptismal succession that would provide him with the believer's baptism that he wanted. And so he spiritually, he really began to wander after that. Nonetheless, he did accomplish some very positive steps for Rhode Island. 1641, went to England to get a charter for Rhode Island. That was because he was afraid that Massachusetts Bay Colony would annex Rhode Island and then impose their church upon them. And he received the charter for the colony in 1644. At that time, he published a treatise called The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, and it was a plea for religious liberty. He gave examples of persecution in Massachusetts. Well, John Cotton, who was the leading Congregationalist pastor in Boston, responded with the bloody tenet washed and made white in the blood of the Lamb, saying that government has a duty to protect fundamental doctrines. And then Williams responds with the bloody tenet, yet more bloody. All right, so we have this war of words going on here, but Roger Williams is credited with being one of the early advocates for religious freedom in America. And even though he was only a Baptist for a short while, nonetheless, I think it is significant that Baptists have had such an important role in pleading for and arguing for religious liberty. Going back to Balthasar Hubmaier, who was an Anabaptist, not the same as an English Baptist or an American Baptist, but nonetheless a Swiss Anabaptist. Balthasar Hubmaier wrote that treatise in favor of religious liberty called On Heretics and Those Who Burn Them. And then Thomas Helwys, a member of John Smith's congregation, who left Amsterdam and founded the first Baptist church on English soil, and he wrote The Mystery of Iniquity, and he also called for religious liberty in the first treatise written in English. And then we have Roger Williams writing The Bloody Tenet. We do have another example that is not in these notes, but a man who is described at length when you take Baptist heritage. His name is John Clark, and John Clark has a similar story in that he was a separatist. He left England, came to America. He also went to Rhode Island, and he founded Newport and founded the congregation there. And just like Roger Williams, he also came to understand from the Bible that believers' baptism is the only correct form. The difference is that once he formed a Baptist congregation, he stayed with it for a number of years. So even though he was the second to establish a colony in Rhode Island, the charter for his colony lasted longer than Williams' charter. Even though he was the second to found a Baptist congregation, his congregation stayed together, and he stayed a Baptist longer. But he also wrote a treatise about religious liberty called Ill News from New England. It's a great story in there about a time when John Clark is pastor of the congregation with two of his leading members, John Crandall and Obadiah Holmes. Remember the name, Obadiah Holmes. These three went from Rhode Island to Boston, Massachusetts. Actually, Lynn, Massachusetts is a suburb of Boston. But one of the elderly parishioners had left the Rhode Island congregation and moved to Massachusetts because of his age, because he'd become blind, and he went to live with his children. But he sent a request for John Clark to come and administer to him the Lord's Supper, because he did not have a Baptist congregation in Massachusetts with which to take the Lord's Supper. So Clark and his two associates went to do this for this man, but while Clark was there, he couldn't resist inviting some others over, preaching to them about believers' baptism, baptizing them, and administering the Lord's Supper, all of this very much against the law in Boston, Massachusetts. And so the three of them were put in jail. Clark hoped to conduct a public disputation with the Boston clergy, but that did not happen. Instead, the bail was paid for Clark and Crandall so that they could leave prison, but Obadiah Holmes refused to allow anyone to pay his bail. And so Obadiah Holmes then was taken out into the public square in Boston, and he was stripped of his shirt, and he was whipped. When he was in public, because of his faith in believers' baptism, or his practice of believers' baptism. So this is persecution of Baptists, in Massachusetts. When it was over, he said, "You have whipped me as with roses." The fact is, he was beaten so bad that he could only rest when he was on his elbows, and he wore those scars for the rest of his life. But fascinating story about Obadiah Holmes and John Clark and John Crandall, and it's all included in this ill news from New England, which then was, just like the Bloody Tenant, was sent to England, and then pressure was added to Massachusetts to mend their ways. All right, that's just a little extra from Baptist Heritage. For those of you who've had it before, that story should be familiar. If you haven't had it, well, you'll hear more about that later. All right, we're going to move from New England down to the South. The southern colonies, especially, we're especially going to talk about Virginia, settled in 1607, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Now, in Virginia, the Church of England enjoyed a majority, and in Virginia, the Church of England was the established church. So just like the Congregationalist church was established in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, the Church of England was established in Virginia. Now also, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and New York had a tax-supported Church of England, but it was not enforced there. So mainly we're going to talk about the Church of England in Virginia. You'll remember that the Church of England had its mission-sending agency, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, who were some of the missionaries that they sent over to America. Talked about it last week. Yes, the Wesley brothers and George Whitefield were sent by the Church of England to America, and mostly they ministered in the middle colonies and New England, so they had a strong work in the South, and particularly in Virginia. They worked primarily with settlers, but some effort was made to evangelize the Indians. And of course, we know the story of Pocahontas, who's associated a lot with Captain John Smith, whose life she saved, but eventually she married John Rolfe, who then took her to England and introduced her to English society. They had a son, Thomas Rolfe, and one of the descendants of Thomas Rolfe is Nancy Reagan. I didn't know that until last night. Anyway, so the Anglicans worked mostly with those who came over from the Church of England, but they did also evangelize some of the Native Americans. Now, in Virginia, Presbyterians and later Baptists gained some strength as the settlement moved beyond the tidewater areas, but still, the Anglican Church is still the strongest. Another colony is Maryland, and Charles I granted this colony to Cecil Calvert, Lord Baltimore. All right, obviously the name of the major city in Maryland. It became a haven for English Catholics. Now Maryland is named for the wife of the Queen, I should say, the Queen of Charles I. Her name was Henrietta Maria. But you might remember that I always thought that Maryland was named after Mary, the mother of Jesus, because Maryland. That kind of helps you remember that Maryland was a haven for Catholics. All right. And then there was some work among the Indians. Maryland was tolerant of other religions, mainly as a means of guaranteeing Catholic freedom. So in the face of domination by Protestants, the Catholics tolerated others so that they could be tolerated. Catholics and the Church of England were minority groups in Maryland. New York, Dutch Reformed initially were strong there. And when the English gained control of this area, the Dutch Reformed made sure that religious tolerance was part of the deal. So what we're seeing is, whereas we have an established church in the north, we have an established church in the south, in the middle colonies, we're seeing toleration. Pennsylvania also, founded by William Penn, for Quakers, but he allowed toleration of other groups. So much so that Philadelphia became a center of Baptist life. And we have the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, have a Philadelphia Association of Baptists. Have I told you all the story of Elias Teach? No? All right. Just real quick. This is a great story, I think. One of the most famous English Baptists was Benjamin Teach. Benjamin Teach had a son, Elias. And just like a lot of preachers' kids, Elias was rebellious. And Elias never did make a profession of faith to follow his father into Christianity or into the Baptist faith. Elias, in fact, left the home of his father and the country of his father and moved to America. And there he settled in Pennsylvania. But as a joke, he'd walk around in clerical dress. And of course, people knew that he was Elias Teach, the son of Benjamin Teach, and so they felt surely he would be a great preacher like his father. And so the Baptist church in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, asked Elias to come and preach. And so on a lark, he decided he would do it. And so he went up to the pulpit and he started preaching a sermon just like the sermons he had heard his father preach over and over again. The difference was that in the middle of this sermon, as he was preaching the gospel, he became convicted himself from his own preaching. So he stopped in the middle of his sermon and he confessed to the congregation that he was living a lie and that he was not truly a Christian. And so he fled the church. He went to a church nearby in Cold Springs, Pennsylvania, talked to the pastor, confessed his sin. The pastor led him to faith in Christ. And guess where Elias Teach ended up pastoring? Back in Pennsylvania. And it was in that community that we have the Philadelphia Baptist Association building up, which became one of the earliest and strongest Baptist associations in America. Isn't that a great story? The power of the gospel. So that's why Philadelphia became important to Baptists. And then in around 1710, Swiss Mennonites arrived and settled in Lancaster County. Of course, that's where we have so many Amish today. So in other words, in Pennsylvania, we have openness and religious liberty. and the middle colonies grew, and that became one of their strengths and one of their financial benefits was religious toleration, and it may have been this very example that got the attention of other colonies to realize that religious toleration really has benefits, obviously spiritual benefits, but financial benefits as well. All right, let's talk about some of the distinctives of early American Christianity. All right, and here is this is a list of distinctives, and you may want to remember at least some of these. All right, one distinctive was that it was English. The original 13 colonies were settled by the English, who infused their traditions into American culture. All right, it was dominated by Protestants. We've already talked about the fact that there were Catholics. There also were some Jewish communities, but predominantly they were Protestant. In fact, many of them believed that God had saved the discovery of America until the advent of Protestantism. All right, they were so convinced in the Protestant Reformation and the faith that came out of it that they felt that this was an opportunity for that faith to become established. And again, this idea of being a city on a hill is an example to the rest of the world. They were diverse. Colonies attracted a wide variety of religious beliefs, as we've already discussed. Congregationalists, Church of England, Quakers, Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists. So a wide variety of religious beliefs. And we have, because of the variety, we're going to develop toleration. The frontier was less inhibiting, and so we have a diverse pioneer population. There are less conformity, more diversity on the frontier. There's a greater dependence on the laity. The Reformation had emphasized the priesthood of the believer. There's a rising aristocracy in America, and among the Church of England in particular, the Anglican nobility resisted the idea of having Anglican bishops come over because they feared that Anglican bishops would suppress the Anglican Church there. Also would bring more influence from the British king. And then the frontiers required the use of laity. And this is what I mentioned when we talked about John Wesley and how the Methodist Church was so successful in America because of their willingness to use lay people. We're going to find the same thing with Baptists. Willingness to use lay people without ordination, without education. These lay preachers were very influential in American Christianity. All right, we have more of a separation of church and state. Obviously, we still have an established church in New England and in Virginia, but in other places, there's more of a separation. There's a distance from England. There's the spaciousness of the frontier. We have rugged individualism of the pioneers. Teachings of the Baptists. I think this is very important. Men like Roger Williams and John Clark began to teach what Baptists have always believed: separation of church and state, complete religious liberty for all people. There's denominationalism. The Puritans and dissenters were the majority. Anglicans were the minority. Congregationalists and Presbyterians were the largest denominations, and then Baptists and Anglicans following after that, but we do have a number of denominations in America. There's an expectant vision in early American Christianity. There's a desire to continue the Reformation, which had become bogged down in Europe. A vision to restore the church to its primitive glory, liberation from the restraining traditions of the old world. Radicals were intent on establishing God's kingdom. Again, the Puritans felt like their colony would be a city on a hill. Baptists and Quakers wanted religious freedom. And there was this idea that God had a divine purpose for America. And this idea of a divine purpose evolved into a civil religion that was focused on national interest. Now, what do I mean by civil religion? Do you have a sense in America that even though, of course, I guess really now we're becoming more and more secular, so you may not sense this as much, but when I was growing up, and really until the last couple of decades, there was a sense that America was a religious nation. And it really didn't matter the denomination. There was a kind of a religion, a kind of a collective religion that united all Americans. The fact that the president still say "God bless America," there is that kind of unity. So we have the civil religion is a religion of the head. Church religion is a religion of the heart. Civil religion is a public religion. It focuses on the nation and its mission. It's kind of a God-given bond that unites the nation for a purpose. We'll talk about manifest destiny, the idea that God had a destiny for America. All of this was a part of civil religion. The missions of civil religion was a light to the nations and a liberator of the oppressed. Okay, we'll talk about this more when we get into the lecture on Christianity in the New Republic, but we're already beginning to see this idea of a civil or public religion in America. All right, the last distinctive is a large unchurched population. Even though in Massachusetts colony there were Sabbath laws that required the citizens to go to church, they were unable to force this everywhere, and lower classes typically had not gone to church in England. The hardships of the frontier competed for time. It was difficult to get to church because of the hard lives that everyone led. And so this led to concerted efforts to reach them, which led to revivalism, which led to the need for a great awakening. And that's going to be the topic of our next lecture. Do y'all have any questions about Christianity in early America?
So like the type of missionary work that went on during this time was something that was just kind of borrowed from everybody else, from like the big guys. Let's go in and conquer them and put a gun to their head, accept Jesus or die, or like what did that?
Okay. All right. What was missionary work like in this period of time? Well, I think when you're talking about this forced conversion, that's more what we see in New Spain. That's more typical of Catholicism. Not that there wasn't something of that in New England. There were efforts in New England to convert the Indians. It was there probably was some coercion early on, but really it was either more persuasion or really more likely it was just ignoring the Native Americans. And there was a sense in New England where there was a hesitation or a negligence of doing mission work among the Indians. Roger Williams was an exception, and there were other exceptions as well who did seek to share the gospel and to genuinely try to persuade the Native Americans to convert to Christianity. Of course, Roger Williams' efforts on behalf of the Native Americans worked out much to his benefit, because when he was banished from Massachusetts, it was the Indians that took care of him. And of course, one of also other thing that aided William's relationship with the Indians was that he denied the ability or the rights of the English just to come in and take the land away from the Indians. He said that they should pay for the land, and he did pay for the land that he settled in Providence, Rhode Island. So there, in New England, we do have some sincere efforts, but mostly we see just negligence of evangelism. Otherwise, of course, earlier when we talked about the Church of England, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, they were coming to evangelize Native Americans, not by coercion, but by persuasion. And then again, in many cases, those who came over as missionaries were more focused on ministering to the settlers than ministering to those indigenous groups of people. Okay? Does that answer your question? Okay? Anything else? Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about the First Great Awakening.